Thanks everyone for joining. This is the first of what we're going to call fire breaks, which will just be really an opportunity for us to get to know all the different cool things that are going on with fire-related work within ANR. And I think I know everyone who's on here, but my name's Lania, and I recently took on a new role developing and directing a fire network within ANR. And really the goal of this new effort is to build kind of more of a cohesive program around fire within ANR, and then to better support and connect all of us who work on fire, because there are so many of us doing really neat fire-related work. And for the most part, we're siloed. So I thought one of the things that we're going to do with this fire network is start trying to connect more and spend a little time getting to know what kinds of cool things are going on, and hopefully maybe work more together across the state and through different statewide initiatives and programs. So today we have two speakers. We have Van Butsic, who's a specialist at UC Berkeley, and Dan Macon, who's a livestock advisor and county director over in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba. And we're going to hear about two pretty different topics. Van's going to talk about some of the research he's been doing on cannabis, and then Dan will talk about his Ag Pass program that he leads in his counties. And then we'll have some time to discuss and ask questions, and we should have you all wrapped up and out of here by 12:45. So I'm going to turn it over to Van. He's going to start us off, and then we'll go to Dan, and then we'll have time for discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Cool. Thank you, Lania. This is nice to see this activity and look forward to participating in today's program, but also in the future, and learning from all of you. So today I'm going to talk about cannabis and wildfire. This is a project that has been going on for a few years, led by a former postdoc, well, actually two former postdocs. One is Jeff Martins, who I think is here, and he can probably actually answer a bunch of questions when I get done. And the other one is Chris Dillis, who's also a former postdoc. He's now a research scientist. Jeff is now a research social scientist for the U.S. Forest Service. And so great guy to collaborate if anybody's looking for new collaborators. All right, real briefly, 3 minutes on the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley. Let me see how I advance my slides. There we go. Background on cannabis. What is it? It's a plant. We all know that, but it's many other things in California. It's a drug. It's still listed as a federal Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, which is means that there's high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use or treatment by the federal government. Of course, California has its own laws around this, which sort of go against the federal rule. 38 states and Washington, D.C. have legal medical marijuana at this point. There's pretty good evidence that it helps some people with pain, insomnia, epilepsy, nausea, and more. And there's ongoing research around this. Natural cash crop, $500 to $4,000 a pound, probably lower than this these days. Although I've heard prices are rebounding a little bit for some of the legal growers this year, so that's interesting news. It's also of particular importance to rural communities. So historically, cannabis has grown in communities where there have been limited other economic opportunities. And so, for California, sort of rural communities, cannabis has long played an outsized economic role and likely will in the future. Big driver of government revenue, $4 billion in state taxes since it was legalized in 2018, plus a lot of county and local taxes as well. That's also a source of crime. There's still a huge unpermitted market of illegal farms, and illegal farms probably outnumber legal farms in the state, and a strong black market persists. Potential environmental threat at times. Certainly, we've seen some of these illegal farms having negative impact on the environment. And also, an interesting model for agriculture. We've also seen many farms that are small scale agriculture production and sustainability oriented practices. And so cannabis is sort of all these things, and it also interacts, interestingly, with wildfire, which we'll see in a second. We have a research center at UC Berkeley. If anybody's interested in cannabis more broadly, feel free to reach out. Interdisciplinary scholarship, social, environmental dimensions of cannabis production. We do what we do at Extension. We do research and we do outreach, try to engage with policymakers and growing communities. Big team of folks, diverse expertise, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so here we go. I asked Chris Dillis to send me his slides to present shamelessly, and instead he said, well, why don't you just show the video I made? That was already prepared and is 8 minutes long, and I said that's perfect. So now we're going to attempt to show Chris's video. So this is Chris Dillis talking here.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher Dillis. I am a researcher here at UC Berkeley in the Cannabis Research Center. And I'm going to be sharing with you today some of the ongoing work we're doing with regards to cannabis and wildfire. So some of this may be a little familiar to people who have been participating in previous seminars, but we're going to be adding some results from some of the new work we've been doing as well. Okay. So really 2020 was the year that I think captured everybody's attention with this. It certainly grabbed a lot of headlines, and it's the year we started looking to answer some questions with data. And so one of the first questions we wanted to ask was, is cannabis different than all other forms of agriculture in California in terms of its risk? It's the threat of wildfire. And so we compared cannabis to grapes and pasture and other forms of crop. There's all other crops in general, on several metrics. And the one I'm showing here is the fire hazard severity metric that's developed by CAL FIRE. So it takes into account, terrain and fuel load, fire weather, and other things into like a composite score that's mapped out in California. And you can see based on the locations of these different farm types, cannabis farms are more often, a higher proportion of them are located in areas that are very high or high fire hazard severity zones compared to anything else in a pretty noticeable way, to say the least. So we also wanted to ask, looking forward into the future, how do these patterns look between cannabis and other crops? And so what we did was we used some wildfire simulation data from California's fourth climate assessment. And that allowed us to sort of map these burn patterns across the landscape. So in a given area, are we expecting new and intensifying hotspots or other forms of hotspots? And so those hotspots are all in the red, orange, and yellow colors here. And you can see the cannabis is just far and away more vulnerable under climate change than any of these other crop types as well. So I think we definitely answered that cannabis is deserving of special attention. And I think that helped us to get funding from the DCC to conduct a study on the actual impacts of wildfire. So we were able to collect about 200 responses to our survey that gave us good data on crop impacts from wildfire smoke, some commonly used mitigation techniques that cannabis farmers are using, and then some reported operational disruptions as a result of wildfire. And so to get at impacts first, what we wanted to do was take the reported impacts and then use those to make estimates for all licensed cannabis statewide. And so what we did was we created a model that predicted impacts based on distance to wildfire and the number of days in the flowering period spent underneath a thick smoke plume. And so as you can see, applying these to all statewide mixed light and outdoor licenses, 2020 and 2021 were both pretty severe years in terms of projected crop losses. In 2020 specifically, almost a fifth if we're going with the higher range of our estimates, and I'll be happy to talk about how we came up with this range. But The other thing I wanted to note was that locally in particular counties, and especially in Northern California, there were particularly bad years. The one that stands out above all others was Trinity in 2021, where our estimates were near 50% production loss as a result of wildfires. So these sorts of statewide, but also very severe localized events are definitely very concerning. And so you'll recall from the survey, we also got data on mitigation techniques that farmers are using, and interestingly, washing the growing crops, whether that's blowing them off or washing them with water, was the most effective, or is viewed as the most effective mitigation technique by farmers. And this is relative to just simply covering them or using automatic irrigation or washing harvested crops. And the other finding to note here is that evacuations were common and they were pretty disruptive. So 70% of respondents reported having an evacuation at some point, and 50% losing site access for some point during the 4-year study period. So the 4-year study period was 2018 through 2021. So okay, and then just to wrap up with our well, I don't say solutions, but some of the approaches that I think need to happen, or that we think need to happen. One of them is just getting agricultural passes into the hands of cannabis farmers. Now, some counties have already done this, and that's fantastic. I think Mendocino and Humboldt and Sonoma maybe also, and maybe a few others have been able to do this already. But this is a statewide issue for wildfire impacts to cannabis, and so just really trying to get coverage statewide, whether or not this is something that the state could lead something like this, or at the very least sort of promote and sanction it. And then finally, it would be very helpful to have a mechanism by which farmers could report these wildfire crop related losses, excuse me. Just because having better spatial coverage and resolution to the data would really allow us to give more sophisticated estimates of production loss, and this would really go a long way to help raise awareness for the issue, but also to help come up with meaningful ways to mitigate some of these losses, perhaps, especially given the issues with getting insurance for wildfire, or for anything for cannabis. So with that, I will end and have you take any questions.
Dan, you want to take it away, and then we'll have some time. If you take about 15 minutes, then we'll still have about 10 minutes to have Q&A with the group. I see there were a couple questions, so we'll make sure to get to those at the end. Oh, Dan, you're muted. Look at us extension people. We're so great at Zoom.
I should have muted the video. I have a face made for podcasting. Well, thank you. And I'll run through these pretty quickly as well, so we can get to the questions here. Can you guys all see the slides like they're supposed to show up?
Yes. Yep. Looks great.
All right. So what I want to talk about today is just kind of how this whole livestock pass, ag pass program emerged, and how it's related really to the fire behavior that we've seen over the last probably 10 years. Talk about why we've taken a multi-county approach and kind of a grassroots effort, and then talk about some of the lessons we've learned and about the ag pass program in Nevada County. So a lot of you have probably seen these pictures. This is Dave Daly, who was president of the California Cattlemen's Association at the time of the North Complex fire. They lost several hundred head of cattle in that fire when it blew up. And that really, I think, got people's attention about the impacts in rangeland. And it's interesting, Van, that graph that you showed looking at pasture, I think pasture certainly makes sense, but rangeland, there's an awful lot of cattle that run in the transitory range on the west slope of the Sierra in the summertime that would would be in some of those high risk areas. Since the rim fire, which is originated in the county that I grew up in, we've seen the scale and rate of spread of wildfire just increase dramatically, both on public and private land. And I think what this has done, in thinking about the fires that I can recall as a kid growing up in the foothills, it's made it so it's virtually impossible to have enough time to gather and evacuate livestock in time of a fire. These things are moving so quickly, and have become so big that it just has really changed that whole dynamic in terms of getting livestock out of harm's way. The other thing that we've seen in many of these fires, Dixie Fire is a great example, is that as ranchers looked at the possibility of lengthy evacuations, we see more of them opting to shelter in place to take care of livestock. And I think that's become a concern for CAL FIRE and for law enforcement as well. And I should acknowledge both Tracy Shore and Matthew Shapiro, who are livestock advisor colleagues, were really on the forefront of developing these programs in response to some pretty significant fires in their areas. In our part of the world, and really all over the state of California now, these commercial rangeland-based livestock production requires really large landscapes. In my part of the world, it takes 16 acres to run a cow for a year. And if you think an economically viable unit might be 300 cows, that adds up to pretty large landscapes. Because ownership is largely fragmented, many ranchers rely on a combination of multiple leases in order to achieve that scale. Most operations here on the west slope of the Sierra still use kind of the follow the green or modified transhumance systems, where they're on rangeland pastures in the late fall to late spring, and then on irrigated pasture, or in public land, mountain meadows or brush ranges from late spring into fall. And really in our part of the world, and kind of from Placer north into Butte County, lots of operations operate in multiple counties. I'll run through some numbers here in a second, but it's very common to run in multiple counties under multiple jurisdictions. So we started in October of 2020 to think about this. That was after the North Complex fire, after the Camp Fire, and I put together a webinar to talk about livestock pass programs, and also this idea of rangeland fire protection associations, which are rancher-led organizations, largely in Eastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho, that have taken on kind of the initial attack component of rangeland fire. And the key outcome was that we formed a 3-county steering committee of ranchers and ag commissioners over the same geographic area that was covered by our local CAL FIRE unit. So our CAL FIRE Ranger unit covers Nevada, Placer, and Yuba. And the ranchers felt like, because many of them operated in 2 and in some cases 3 of those counties, that it would be really beneficial to have a consistent program across all 3 counties. We started working with law enforcement, with CAL FIRE, and with the ag departments in the spring of 2021, and got the program off the ground that 2021 fire season. And incidentally, I'll come back to this in a second, but when we first talked about the idea of these rangeland fire protection associations, CAL FIRE was very reluctant to even remotely suggest it was an option in California. And as a consequence of the relationships that we built through the Ag Pass program, I think that's back on the table. That there may be some areas where ranchers can be kind of initial attack in some of these places that CAL FIRE can't get to. And I did throw up, just to show you kind of our diversity of our steering committee. We had the ag commissioners from all 3 counties. Yuba Sutter Farm Bureau was a big part of that, but it was really driven by the ranchers there, who could talk directly with CAL FIRE and with law enforcement and say, here's why we need this program. So our program elements include a definition of commercial livestock operation. So this is not for the person with the 5 pygmy goats in the backyard needing animal control to come help get their goats evacuated. In our definition, a commercial operation is 50 head of livestock that can include animals in utero. So it essentially is 25 female breeding age female animals, 100 head of chickens or other poultry, 100 head of rabbits, or 50 colonies of bees. Everybody that signs up has to go through an initial 4-hour training, in-person training. And then to renew, there's a 1-hour renewal training that we provide online. And that really provides a program overview, provides some information from CAL FIRE and law enforcement about fire behavior and fire line safety and the incident command system. And then we also go through a kind of a ranch level disaster planning talk and really encourage people to put together a written disaster plan for their operation. The emphasis is really on access to the evacuation zone, not on evacuating livestock. And again, even at that smallest level, at 25 mother cows, that's not something you're going to evacuate with 1 gooseneck load. That's essentially a semi-load if you're going to evacuate just those 25 cows. We also focus at the direction of county council on this release of liability that everybody has to sign in order to get the pass. And I think probably one of the greatest accomplishments is to get county councils in 3 separate counties to all sign off on the same release of liability. It's rare for attorneys to even agree what day of the week it is. And we got them to agree that this release was okay. We then print a color pass with a photo that we send to each ag commissioner in the home county of the operation. They seal it and then send it to the producers, and that has to be presented at the time of an incident at the roadblock in order to gain access. The key element of this, I think, though, is that CAL FIRE and the local agencies are involved in the training. And I'll talk about the importance of these relationships in just a second. But the pass itself, the training is important, but really for a rancher to know who from CAL FIRE is likely to be the first on the fire on their place is really, really valuable. For the sheriff's department to know that they can call Cooperative Extension when they've got something else going on is really, really valuable in terms of relationships. So just in terms of our first 2 years, we're just completing the trainings for year 3 as we speak. But most of our ranchers are from Nevada County, which really corresponds to what Van was talking about in terms of cannabis production. I think, a lot of the livestock production in Nevada County is in very fire prone areas, perhaps different than the lower elevations of Placer County or Yuba County. We've got a mix of livestock species, but predominantly most people have beef cattle, and a number of people have sheep, which is indicative of the kinds of rangeland operations that we have in the 3 counties. The average pass holder has almost 2.5 properties in 1.5 counties. So it does make sense to cross county boundaries with this. And over 1/3 of the pass holders had more than 1 species of livestock, which I think is interesting as well. You talk to cattle producers here and they wouldn't be caught dead with a sheep on the ranch, but there are a number of them that have sheep on the ranch. So it's kind of interesting to find out in the real world what's happening. So a couple of lessons. Last year was our 2nd year, and we actually had a pretty major fire in each of the counties. The mosquito fire obviously was the most severe. But what we found, just like there are no atheists in foxholes, people who forget to renew their pass suddenly remember that they forgot to renew their pass when a fire breaks out on the neighboring ranch. And so one of the things that we discovered at that point was that recording the refresher training and setting it up so that they had to watch the whole thing before they knew what their next step was allowed us to facilitate people taking the training once a fire had broken out, getting a pass from the ag department, and being able to then ultimately get access to their ranch. So I think that was really helpful. One of the things we found in the winding fire is that it was not a huge fire. It didn't become a campaign type fire. And so Yuba County Office of Emergency Services was not activated for that fire. And as a consequence, we had one person who was evacuated who wanted to use their pass. And because OES was not stood up for that fire, they didn't have a mechanism for allowing access. That person subsequently told us, if I'd have known that, I wouldn't have left the ranch. And when we conveyed that to law enforcement, I think we've got better systems in place in some of these kind of mid-scale fires to be able to address those issues. We did find in the mosquito fire that there are a number of grazing permittees in the higher elevations of the Tahoe National Forest that are not based in either of these three counties. So they may be based in Sacramento County or in El Dorado County. And so as a consequence, they were not aware of the program. And I think we need to do a better job of working with Forest Service and BLM to reach those folks. In the Rices fire, we did have some crop agriculture and some cannabis production that were impacted. And because they were not part of the program last year, local law enforcement was not willing to accommodate people getting access. And that really drove what I'll talk about here in a minute in developing that program in Nevada County. And then the last piece of this, I think, is just that relationships are so critical. And I'll use a little anecdote on this. We had a targeted grazing contractor who had moved all of their livestock out of the evacuation zone for the mosquito fire, but they still had equipment just past the roadblocks. And there was definitely a language barrier between the folks trying to retrieve the equipment and the sheriff's deputies managing the roadblocks. Sunday night at 8 o'clock, I was able to reach the sheriff's lieutenant who we'd worked with on the program and say, hey, can you let this person through? They're going a mile up the road. All they need to do is pick up a couple of trailers. And he said, absolutely. Just tell him if he goes any further than picking up the trailers, we'll arrest him, but let him in. And so I think that relationship would not have happened had we not done the livestock pass training earlier in the summer. So there is now a statewide program focused on livestock that is supposed to be developing a statewide curriculum. That's been slow to develop. And in the interim, counties are able to continue their programs, which is what we're doing this year. I talked about the challenges in foothill crop production. It's very different in Nevada County and in kind of the foothill portions of Placer and Yuba that it might be on the valley floor. And very similar, I think, to cannabis in terms of kind of the needs for access. We're also seeing that there may be other types of disasters, floods, or foreign animal disease outbreaks that this will facilitate a more coordinated response. And so this year, really with the leadership of the Nevada County Ag Commission, and Nevada County is the only county of the three in my program that has legal cannabis. They are expanding the program to include commercial crop production, permitted commercial cannabis production, and then we had omitted horses from our initial program, and we're going to include horses in Nevada County. And one of the interesting things about cannabis from a county-based extension perspective, we have been told that we are not supposed to work with cannabis production because of our USDA funding. And so hopefully there's nobody who writes that USDA check on the call today. But I told the Nevada County Ag Commissioner, as far as I'm concerned, this is an ag pass training. I don't control who is invited to come to it. And so I would expect, we're doing the training this Wednesday, and I would expect about half of the folks that show up are going to be cannabis, which will be interesting. And that's the end of mine. I'll quit sharing screen now too, and happy to answer questions.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. Perfect timing. So we have about 10 minutes for questions for either of these folks or for people to share about their own programs. I know people like Grace from Siskiyou also have an Egg Pass program that they run. So yeah, go ahead, you guys. There actually was one question from Barb in the chat that Jeff answered, but we might want to just highlight it. Barb was asking, how do we find out if there's permitted cannabis in your county? And it looks like Jeff suggested reaching out to the ag commissioner, but I don't know if anyone had anything else they wanted to say about that, Van or Jeff Martin or anyone else.
Yeah, your ag commissioner should know, there's a number of sort of online maps that different law firms put together that show, I can Google around and probably throw one in the chat here in a minute. But yeah, ag commissioner, I guess, should probably be the real, the real knowledgeable person.
Jeff Stackhouse, were you going to say something? I saw you unmute.
No, I was just saying that every county handles it a little differently. So like for us, it's not the ag commissioner that handles the permitting side. That's in county planning for Humboldt County. But the ag commissioner will be involved in some way, shape, or form and will know who to send you to if it's not the ag commissioner. So every county looks a little differently. But the ag commissioner will know where to point you. It's a good place to start.
You know, something to add to that, Jeff, I think is important generally for those of us in extension, is that a county agency needs to stand behind these passes. It's not cooperative extension issuing a pass. It's county ag department or another county agency that issues the pass and is responsible for enforcement if there's a problem with the pass holder. And I think it's important for us in extension to kind of retain that relationship. My role is in organizing and facilitating training. It's not in policing compliance with the pass.
So Van, I have a question for you just about kind of the implications of your research, or what like where are the policy implications of that? I mean, I know you said that it would be nice if the counties were actually capturing this in some way or counting it, but what do you plan on doing with this information that you collected? So there are a lot of equity issues, and I mean, it's kind of interesting social stuff there.
Yeah, I see Jeff's hand raised. Jeff, do you want to answer this? You were Jeff was actually the main person who built and administered the survey and has analyzed those results actually more than I have. So
perfect.
Jeff, if you want
yeah, I saw that Van was going to be on this, and I said I should probably show up to help him out. Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Martin. As Van said, I'm a former postdoc at Berkeley. Now I'm a research social scientist with the Forest Service based out of Arcata. This has been a great opportunity for me to kind of listen in, because this kind of unites two of my previous projects, one on livestock and one on cannabis. And now I'm working on fire. So as Van said, feel free to get in touch if you need a collaborator. Definitely gotten some guidance that's what they want me working on. For probably obvious reasons. So I'll just say a couple words on the project. As Van said, we sort of surveyed statewide growers. I noted in the chat the number of responses we actually got. The survey focused on impacts as well as mitigation, just to speak to a little bit of what you're asking about, Lenya. And we have a couple papers sort of in different states of progress. Van shared one that has already been published. We have another one sort of emphasizing the fire and smoke sort of modeling, as well as economic or estimated economic impacts around the state. So that's maybe some sort of policy implication, is just to look at the scale of these impacts. And as Van said, sort of some way of maybe recording those losses. Our second paper, which I'm hoping to have a draft in the pipeline by the end of the summer, is kind of looking at other impacts, as well as those mitigation strategies, right? What are different producers doing sort of on farm, on site to reduce the threat of wildfire, to deal with the impacts of smoke, as well as ash fall and smoke taint, which were another sort of key part of our findings, was sort of the ways in which ash and smoke were in many cases kind of more significant for producers, right? Because not everybody's getting hit by direct burn, but many more are getting affected by fires generally. Some of those impacts we noted in our responses were included sort of effects on plant growth. So thinking of sort of spaces for future research, is how light reduction through smoke plumes actually affected plant growth, because of course this is during the period in which those plants are sort of your producers are hoping that those plants are growing. We saw reduced rates, or producers reported reduced rates of growth, as well as impacts from ash, pest disease. So some producers were sort of flagging different strategies that they use to deal with that, whether those were blowing leaf blowers to blow ash off of crops in the field, different forms of dipping or washing, or drying to reduce those impacts of smoke, taint, and the like. So we're hoping to at least sort of flag some of that. And again, opportunities for future research around actually testing the effectiveness of that, going beyond kind of producer perceived effectiveness to some kind of experimental test. There's probably some other stuff, but I'll shut up for now. Thanks so much for having me, though.
Thanks for joining, Jeff. Jeff and I met up in Arcata recently for breakfast, and I was telling him about some of the stuff I'm working on, and this came up. He's like, I worked with Van on this cannabis study. Like, you better show up for this this talk he's giving. Does anyone else have more questions for Van or Dan, or comments on the work that they're doing?
I have a question. Thank you both. Those are really interesting presentations. I'm really interested in this RFPA model. I know it's been really successful up in Oregon, and like you said, it's largely based around relationships. I'm just curious how those conversations are going, and whether CAL FIRE is open to that kind of a model here in California and working with the ranchers involved.
Great question. And RFPA stands for Rangeland Fire Protection Associations. They're basically kind of neighborhood organized groups of ranchers that have some equipment and some training and are able to be kind of initial attack to fires that are too difficult for mostly federal agencies to get right on. And the perspective of CAL FIRE really depends on who you talk to, I think, which is largely my experience generally with CAL FIRE. But I think in light of the last couple of years, you know, there were instances in some of the North Bay complex fires and certainly in the Dixie fire where more remote rangeland operations were not a priority when it came to structure protection. And so there would be days or even weeks at a time where ranchers wouldn't see anybody from the fire service at all. And so I think CAL FIRE has started to acknowledge that there are some remote locations that in the event that they're having to do structure protection are going to take second priority, and that perhaps some training for the folks that live and work in those more remote locations would be beneficial. The first feedback I had from CAL FIRE was from a battalion chief who told me there's no way that'll work here. And the second interaction I had was with his boss saying, hey, just keep us informed. It sounds like a really interesting idea. So I think it's something we probably need to keep pushing on in the communities that the more remote communities that we're working in. And certainly there's some liability issues for ranchers that they need to think about as well. But I think there's some opportunities there.
That's really exciting. Thank you.
It wouldn't be the first time we've heard CAL FIRE say there's no way that that'll work here. No, we say, well, let us show you. Cool. Well, we have about 1 more minute. Does anyone else have a question they want to get in there or a comment before we wrap this up? I guess I had one more question for Dan. You said that the Ag Pass program is kind of becoming a statewide program. So who is administering that then? So
it is administered by county ag departments, but the training is supposed to be developed by the state fire marshal.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds like I have not been a part of the meetings, but there's been a committee of folks that has included folks from California Cattlemen's Association and Cooperative Extension working on that statewide curriculum. The initial curriculum was largely based on the contractor training that CAL FIRE does for equipment operators and private fire companies. And it's not, in my opinion, not totally applicable to a ranch setting. So I think that's where the statewide program is going to hopefully be better.
Okay, cool. Well, great. I think we're at time. I wanted to include one quick thing. I'm just put a link in the chat. Last year, this reporter who was written for the New York Times reached out, and she wanted to do a story on some of the wildfires that were happening. And I told her, if you go to my hometown of Hayfork in Trinity County, you'd be remiss not to talk to a pot grower. And so she did go there, and she spent some time with my mom for like 3 days, and she didn't end up writing a lot about it, but she did in this article, which is a great article. I highly recommend reading it. She does mention talking to a pot grower in Hayfork, and I thought that was pretty cool because I think it's such an invisible demographic, the pot growing community. So anyway, that's an interesting side note. One other thing is, if you have ideas, we're going to keep doing these sessions into the future, probably about once a month. And I just really want to thank Katie for pulling this together and doing a lot of the organizing. But if you have ideas, or if you have something you want to give a talk on, like, that's really the idea, is to share with each other, get to know each other, and do more work together. So we will post this recording, and we'll have a link to the recording if you want to share it or watch it again. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.